Hello everyone, welcome to the first ever episode of Rowe Writes. In this series, I'm going to be talking about how I write my stories and the underlying narrative principles that I'm wrestling with along the way. My hope is that these talks somehow help other writers working through narrative issues in their own work, or are informative, or perhaps are an interesting way for people to see how at least this one fiction writer works. So a few overarching principles for these talks. All of these will be done through the frame of my lecture series, The Mechanics of Fiction Writing, which are free and available on YouTube, and they are linked in the description. So if you hear me using terminology that you don't understand, what I'll try to do is link specific lectures. The series itself will always be linked to the main playlist, but the specific lectures, if we come across them, I'll reference those, or I'll try to. Leave me a comment if I don't. I'm going to try to keep things basic enough in these talks that everyone can understand what I'm talking about, so general terminology if you're not familiar with those lectures. But if I do use a narratology term, call me out on it. I'll do my best to keep things simple so that everybody can understand what the heck I'm talking about. Also, I'm going to presume that everyone here listening has already listened to the story that I'm discussing. So if you haven't yet and you don't want the story spoiled, click off to the story itself, which is linked in the description, and then you can come right back for the breakdown. So the story we're discussing today is The First Man, and that was published last week, so hopefully you've had time to listen to it. Primarily, the two things I'm going to be talking about today are plot and the implicit and explicit things that I think about as a writer when I'm writing. So those two things, specifically plot more than anything, seems to be the thing that writers struggle with more than anything else. And I say that as somebody who's read through the slush piles in a literary magazine and been to a lot of workshops and talked to a lot of writers. And it seems to be something that people have a hard time talking about. And a big reason for that is that there's not a good framework for it, or there wasn't a good framework for it. Not to pat myself too hard on the back, but one of the reasons I wrote Mechanics was that there wasn't a really good way to think about plot in a productive way that people could talk about it and share a vocabulary about it and sort of understand like what is this story trying to do in terms of the way the plot is structured. So that's why I'm going to start talking with plot, and probably as this series goes along, hopefully it won't get too monotonous. And then as it does get monotonous, I'll just talk about other things like the narrative posture or the space or whatever else. But I'm starting with plot. Generally, so I guess first let's start with this other idea of the explicit and the implicit. So one of the things, as I'm talking about plot in this talk, I don't want people to come away with the impression that I'm thinking about all of this stuff at the forefront of my mind as I'm writing. I am not doing that. And I'll get into specifically what I do know before I start versus what I don't know. But what you don't want to be doing is sitting at the keyboard thinking about a million things. It's kind of like if anyone's tried golf or any other sport like that, where you have a swing and you have a process and somebody tries to give you a million different tips and you can literally only think of like one or two things as you swing the golf club. Like that can really mess up a golfer's swing. And really writing the story, you have to focus on writing the story, not 10 different plot elements and how they're all blending together. Okay, so I'm not thinking about a million different things as I write. I'm thinking about sort of the characters working their way through the situation that's presented to them in the story itself. What do I need to know before I sit down to write in order to make that situation organic? How to get that situation develop in a way that seems natural to the reader. Okay, so generally, what I must know when I start to write is what the primary plot element is. So I really have to have a main idea. What type of narrative am I dealing with? Then I need to know who the key players are. Like, who are the main characters? And then the last thing I want to know is, or not necessarily know, but have a pretty good sense of, is like, how will the resolution of that initial plot element manifest itself? And we'll get into the details here, so you know what I'm talking about with respect to this. What I don't always know are the details. How the specific elements will unfold in this in the story that bring us to that resolution, maybe not even what the resolution will be. And these things are different with every story. In this story, what I'm talking about is a stranger narrative. And of course, the stranger in this story comes in the form of Transom coming into this environment. And we'll get into specifically what a stranger narrative is, how it works, what it should do, how it sort of manifests in this story. The main characters in this story obviously are Broyle, and I would say he's the main character. He goes through a transformation. He has an arc from where he begins to where he ends. So more than anything, it's his story. But also another key main character in this story is Transom himself, who essentially is the change. The plot elements that are present in this story, and there are a lot of them. We have death that comes in the form of the super soldier, danger, which is present throughout, which is sort of the same, comes from the super soldiers and combat in general, violence inherent in combat, and of course there's a goal for every one of these characters to survive. There's conflict, and that comes in the form of Transom's goals, and of course what Broyle thinks Transom's goals should be, and they have this sort of conflict about how Transom is leading. There's also a very large betrayal in the way that Transom presents himself as the friend and savior to all of these naive Ateran soldiers. And of course he knows this from the outset, and he's operating from the framework of how do I get these guys to do what I need them to do, even if it means that they're going to put themselves in great jeopardy. And of course he lies to them about, or at least misrepresents what the situation really is in order to get them out onto the battlefield in the place he needs them to be, in order for the situation to play out as it does. And that's a huge betrayal of their trust. The last major one of these minor plot elements, major-minor, is the transgression, which in narrative terms, the fancy narrative term for it is a violated interdiction. There's something that you should not do, and you violate that boundary. And the character always has a choice in a transgression to do the right thing or do the wrong thing, and sort of makes, in this case, Broyle makes the choice to allow Transom to take off the Ateran soldier's head. And there are some larger implications for that thematically that we'll discuss a little later, and hopefully I'm not too long-winded about that, but that's something that was interesting that came out of this story that I didn't necessarily have in mind at the start. It sort of came out of it. And so all of those minor plot elements that are here work in service of the major overarching stranger narrative. And one of the principles that I strongly believe in terms of writing a short story is that a short story should have one overarching grammatical plot element. And again, the writer probably should have a really good idea of what that is. I would say I sit down and I start. I always know what that major plot element is when I start. And it should be a grammatical plot. And what I mean by that, this is a direct reference to Lesson 9, is that the major plot element comes in the form of a suspense cue that is introduced to the reader. In other words, it poses a question to the reader that's interesting enough to them that they want to stick around to find out what happens. In this case, that initial suspense cue is Transom coming to this outpost, and the idea for the reader is, how does this guy change things on Priam in such a way that's so interesting that I want to find out about it? And then the second part of this grammatical structure are the constraints, and it's usually at least one, but usually more than one. And these constraints work to close off possible outcomes for the characters and for the story, and funnel the story into a narrow window of possible outcomes and bring the story to a suspenseful conclusion. And so an example of that in this story would be the deaths of the soldiers in Broyle's company. So once those soldiers are dead, it closes off all of the possible outcomes where they can affect the story after that. And of course, there are more constraints along the way. We listed off, 6 or 7 minor plot elements that all serve as constraints to this larger narrative. But that's just one that's really easy and quick to talk about. And of course, the resolution is sort of the answer to that initial question that was posed to the reader. Like, how did Transom's arrival here affect the outcome? I call this a stranger narrative, and its stranger narrative should have specific implications that go along with it. So the first is that with that introduced plot element, what the stranger does when they come into the story is that they're disrupting a settled social space. And the disruption is going to come in the form of the constraints, all of those other minor plot elements that happen because this stranger came to town. And they may function as smaller grammatical plots in their own right, such as the choice and the transgression that Broyle has at the end there. That has its own grammatical narrative to it, but all of that, again, is in service of that overarching grammatical structure of the stranger narrative. The resolution happens, of course, when the reader finds out what does the social structure look like after Transome has left. What does he leave behind? And of course, specifically, when you talk about this narrative, the stranger, Transome, came in, disrupted the place, got everybody killed, and then the resolution to this particular stranger narrative is that he leaves behind a new CO who's at the top of the military hierarchy there, but also the social hierarchy in control of the base with a whole bunch of younger people. Broyle is also a whole lot less naive about what his function is and what war is, and he is suddenly in charge of a whole bunch of people who were in his position, naive to the horrors of war, and that's the new equilibrium. So the way the stranger narrative works, in comes the stranger, shakes everything up, and we come to a new equilibrium at the end of it. So that's really the plot structure of this story. The question is, how much of that did I really start out with at the beginning? So I start out with that explicit idea of this story, of this mysterious stranger whose specialty is killing these super soldiers, comes to this base, and a whole bunch of stuff is going to have to happen in order for him to kill all those super soldiers, and it's going to affect the outcome. What do I know about that when I start? Really, if I'm talking about only knowing a few things as I start, the situation sort of plays out as the story goes along, and I'm sort of along for the ride to some extent. So a good example of this is, how does Adam become Adam? Do I know at the outset that I'm going to be dealing with that situation? And the answer to that is no. I didn't even know that they were going to interact with each other. That sort of came about when I realized that, okay, once Transome and Broyle shoot down this ship, the next objective militarily would be to make sure that they killed the people. And then, of course, as they're traveling to that ship, the reality that, as a writer, is that that's going to be a heck of a lot more interesting if there's somebody still alive in that ship. So that is not necessarily something that, as the writer, I sit down with and say, oh, I know all of this in advance. X is going to happen, and then Y is going to happen, and then Z is going to happen. The scenario dictates a good chunk of what happens. Specifically with respect to Adam, why is that person Adam, right? They could be any other person, but it has to be Adam, or it did in this case. That became obvious to me in the moment. Writing stories is really complicated, and the writer doesn't have total command of all of these things. Specifically with respect to the sort of biblical undertones of this character, Adam. But it really overlays very nicely with the biblical story, because you have this major transgression, and that major transgression also overlays very nicely with the idea of the loss of innocence, right? And the gaining of sort of the forbidden or terrible knowledge that comes along with being a warfighter, right? If there's anything that would make a human being lose their innocence faster, I don't know what it is. And that specific situation, Broyle has that moment where he has a choice, right? In the same way that Adam had a choice, right? Do I eat the apple or do I not eat the apple? And Broyle's choice is obviously like, do I stick my neck out and tell Transome, no, you're not going to take that guy's head, or do I let it happen? And, clearly he makes the same choice that Adam did. It's like, war is terrible, this is going to happen, and it's also going to change me. And again, like, this thematic element was not necessarily explicit and in my mind. It certainly wasn't at the start of the story. So how does it happen that Adam, that the name Adam comes out? Really, that choice happened as I'm sitting at the keyboard and say, well, what's this soldier's name? And why is the name important? Why does he reach out to Transome to try and get Transom's name. He's trying to personalize. He's trying to make a connection so that maybe this guy who shot him down will show him the respect soldier to soldier so that he might make it through the war. So he reaches for a name. He tries to get the guy's name. He tries to build a personal connection. You know, what do? You say, hey, I'm X. And why does X become Adam? It might be serendipitous, but that was the name that came to mind in the moment as I'm writing the story. And then all of these thematic implications that just overlaid nearly perfectly with the situation just sort of happened. And that is part of the mystery of story writing. And does that have to do with neural connectivity or divine inspiration? I guess that's what you call the muse, right? But the specific thing that Adam was on my mind at the moment was that I was at a coffee shop. I forget which day it was, probably Saturday. And that was the part where I was so I was probably writing like the first half of the story. And there was a bread on the menu at the coffee shop called like the Adama bread. And of course I started thinking about that as the sci-fi fan that I am. It's like, oh, Captain Adama bread. And of course, like, there are those same implications of that Adama as the first progenitor of the human species, or at least Lee Adama at the end of that series. And I guess that's where that came from. Or maybe, who knows, right? But the overarching theme there is that, yeah, you start with an idea of like, this will be a stranger narrative, and here are my characters. And it has to have this sort of structure. Those are the guidelines. Now, what are the specifics that happen along the way? And the story takes me with it from the initial plot element to the resolution. Okay, that's probably enough for now. Hopefully this was interesting. I hope that in this series, going through stories in this way will help other writers to think about plot structurally. And I guess what happened for me when I started thinking about stories in that way is that it helped me to have an understanding of how stories function and what were the things that I needed to do versus what were the things that I could allow to develop along the way. So I guess to sum up in this one, for this particular story, I needed to know that it was a stranger narrative. I needed to know that Broyle and Transom were the main characters. I needed to know what their roles were in that relationship. And I needed to know that Transom's presence would irrevocably change the equilibrium of that base. And then once he arrives with that mandate. The Trasp soldiers do the same thing. And then it's just a question of, okay, well, how does that play out specifically? And then just allowing it to bubble up and creating a story. All right, that's enough for now. Hope everyone got something out of this. We'll see how it goes, and if people are finding them valuable and useful, I'll keep doing them. So please do leave feedback if you find this useful. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you next time.